This is Near-DeathTV. I'm your host, Laura Ketchledge. I'm also an author. In 1979, I became a near-death experiencer. I chose to explain the truth I learned about the afterlife, reincarnation, and near-death experience through my fictional book series, The Near-Death Saga. While dead, I was shown all human beings are shrouded in ignorance by design, in order to learn valuable lessons in each incarnation. When you die, the artificial facade falls away, and we awaken from the dream into reality. For more information, you can find us at neardeathtv.com. Please join us as we explore the after effects of near-death experience. Welcome to another episode of Near-Death TV. I'm your host, Laura Ketchledge. I'm also an author, filmmaker, and most important, a near-death experiencer. Today, we have a very special guest. He is a doctor, an emergency room doctor, as a matter of fact, Dr. Jeff O'Driscoll. And he's also the author of the book, Not Yet. Jeff, how are you today?
I'm great. It's good to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Wow. You have such a unique story. Let me just inform the listeners that I interviewed Jeffrey Olson in a previous episode, and he had a very, very intense near-death experience during a car accident where his wife perished and so did his son. He took tremendous courage to go through the physical recovery, but you have a connection to him. Dr. O'Driscoll was you were his emergency room doctor. Can you tell us the night that Jeffrey Olson came into your ER?
Yes, Jeff was involved in that horrible crash and was taken to a local hospital where he was stabilized and then put on a plane and flown to the trauma center where I was on duty. And when I entered the trauma room, he was unconscious on the gurney, and a team of providers were already providing his care when I entered the room. And standing above the gurney was his recently deceased wife, Tamara, observing his care, and she communicated to me her profound gratitude for what we were doing to save her husband's life. I had never met her before, or Jeff, before that time, but I knew who she was, and we had this profound communication. And it led to Jeff and I having a 23-year friendship.
Oh my gosh. Okay, Jeff, so when you walked into the ER, listeners want to know, how did his wife appear? Was she hovering above him? Was she next to him? Did she look solid? Did you get an impression of her? And the shock you must have felt seeing this, man struggling for his life and then his deceased wife. What are the details in this?
There was only one other person in the emergency department that knew that I had these kind of experiences. She was a nurse, and she had similar experiences. And she and I were the only ones that ever talked to each other about them. And I wasn't going to be involved in Jeff's care. There was another doctor there and another team that were providing his care, but she came and grabbed me by the arm and dragged me to the trauma room, said, "You have to come down here. His wife is here." And I didn't know what she was talking about at first, but she was persistent. Then I realized what she was saying, because I knew that the trauma patient inbound to our hospital wife was deceased at the scene. So when I entered the room, others were taking care of him. I had no responsibility for his medical care. And his wife, Tamara, was standing in the air above the gurney. She appeared to be in perfect form. I was aware that she was not a physical being, that she was a spiritual being, but she had the form and likeness of somebody that was in their physical form. And we communicated telepathically, and there was a profound flow of knowledge of who she was, who Jeff was, that he would live. She knew he'd live. I knew he'd live despite his horrible injuries, and that there was something profound in his future.
Oh my gosh. As a doctor, it had to be, even though you're a sensitive and this has occurred before, must have been a profound shock that his, late wife is hovering over, and is she drawing you into his care?
She was merely expressing her gratitude for his care. And in fact, that was one of the things that resonated with Jeff. We didn't speak that day because he was unconscious, and I didn't expect to ever see him again. But a month later, this same nurse came and grabbed me by the arm and said, "We have to go tell Jeff what happened." And I said, "No, we don't. You go tell him if you want, but I don't need to share my spiritual experiences with a total stranger." And she was persistent, and she drugged me up to his hospital room. And I kind of stood in the corner and didn't say much. She did the talking, and she experienced the same thing. She saw Tamara as well. And as she started to share our experience, Jeff broke down and started to cry. And that was when he first divulged that he'd had an out-of-body experience at the scene of the accident where Tamara had told him, "You have to go back and raise our son." And so there was a mutual kind of reassurance there that connected us into the rest of our lives.
Well, Dr. Jeff, I think you have an amazing psychic ability. And then you've taken your life and you incorporated into your healing care as a doctor. Now, you've been an emergency room physician for what, 25 years?
Yes, that's right.
That's a long time. When did you have your first occurrence, via the hospital where you had perceived a deceased person?
Well, my first experience came long before I was in the ER. When I was 11, my 15-year-old brother Stan died in a farm accident. And it was only shortly after that that I started to get messages, first just kind of audible messages, although not hearing them with my physical ear. It's more of a knowing. It's more of a feeling the message and the words in your soul. And when I was 16, my brother spoke to me when I was driving a car much too fast after dark on a narrow, windy country road, and he told me I had to slow down. And for some reason, I listened. And as I slowed down and went around the corner, hit another car head on, there was a lot of damage, but nobody was hurt. And I think I might have died in that accident if he had not spoken to me and told me to slow down. So by the time I got to the ER, I was very accustomed to these kind of experiences over the decades prior to my practicing medicine.
Now, he's still your big brother, even though he's not in physical reality, which is comforting. Okay, so do you think that this was a genetic roll of the dice, like had there been sensitive or psychics in your family, Jeff, or had you experienced a near-death or out-of-body experience as a child, perhaps?
I don't recall ever having any kind of an experience as a child that would have predisposed me to these kind of things. Mm-hmm. And I have no reason to think that it was genetic. I'm not aware of anybody in the family that describes these kind of experiences. So I don't have a good answer for why I have these experiences and other people don't. I just know over the years I've come to recognize and accept it, and ultimately in the last few years embrace it finally. I never spoke about it for all the time I was practicing medicine, but I recently stopped seeing patients, and now for some reason it feels like it's okay to talk about.
I think that's a pretty, I think you had to stay in a safety zone because you had a profession, a career to protect, as a doctor. And, I think I can relate to that because I didn't talk about my near-death experience for 30 years. I mean, nobody wants to be labeled as a freak or a wackadoo. We don't get a message from the dog down the street and Bigfoot's not in the backyard. So you had this wonderful gift or this ability of perception, and you were able to see it and experience it in the ER with Jeffrey Olson, which is amazing. So you've Could you perceive the, his wife's love and concern for Mr. Elson?
Oh, absolutely. These experiences are virtually always accompanied by this profound, ineffable love that people are unable to describe after their experience. And I had that as well, not just with Tamara, but on a number of other occasions as well. Tamara still comes to me on occasion. In fact, at one point in time, Jeff was looking at some business deals, and we were talking about doing more things together, maybe speaking together and doing some things like that. And I don't remember what there was that was going on, but Tamara came to me once and said, don't let anything come between your friendship. That was her word of caution.
Well, I think that, our loved ones are only one dimension away, and I think these dimensions overlap. That's my personal hypothesis. Could you share with us another, without revealing, violating anybody's privacy, another shared near-death experience in the ER?
Yes, I went to work one day and was at the computer about to start my shift to log on, and I felt this profound spiritual presence. I'd had enough experience by then that I recognized it was a spiritual being near me, and I was aware that around the corner in one of the resuscitation rooms, a physician and a team of people were trying to resuscitate a woman who was unconscious and not breathing. They'd intubated her. They were literally doing chest compressions. And I sensed her spirit near me, and she asked me for help. And my initial response was, why in the world would you ask me for help? What do you think I can do for you? But I walked into the room, and I quietly stood in the room for a few moments. Nobody paid any attention to me because I was a doctor and I was starting my shift anyway. So I just walked over and quietly rested my hand on her leg because I'd learned that touch was so important in these kind of experiences. The doctor was still giving orders. People were still doing chest compressions. I had absolutely no impact or responsibility on her medical care. I was just standing at the bedside, and she asked me if she could leave. And I thought, why are you asking me? But at the same moment, I had this flood, this download, and I spoke to her from some eternal place, and I said, if you think it's time to go and you feel right about it, then it's probably okay. And as I said that, silently, of course, telepathically, she rose up out of her body and she stood in the air above the gurney. She looked to be in perfect physical form and about half the age of the physical body she'd just come out of. Yeah. She filled me with glory and light, and then she thanked me and she left. And as I walked out of the room behind me, I heard the doctor in military time pronounce her time of death. And I remember thinking, oh, yeah, I know. I saw her leave. That was how my day began, my shift that day.
Oh, wow. I know that, seeing such things is a very humbling feeling that you must have had. When you saw her body, was she all white or was she in color?
The colors are softened. It seems like it's all white, but there's, shades of different tones of color and things. And interestingly enough, although it's all this clear image in one's mind of what you see, sometimes the details are clear and sometimes they're very obscure, but it doesn't matter because what you're getting is this pure form of communication that transcends either sight or sound.
Exactly. When I was with my dog when she died, and I saw her come out of her body, and she looked so young, and she had long hair again. It was pretty much a shock, but I always compared it to a black and white movie, the coloring, because there just isn't words to express what I saw. So when this woman, was released and she wasn't alone, I think she took great comfort, I imagine, that, she had help making her decision to leave. So have other people done the same? So many people die
Other
in the
people
emergency room.
My experiences have been wide and broad in their variety, and they're all very, very different. They share some similar elements, but none of them is entirely typical of another. I remember walking into a room one day, another physician was resuscitating this woman who had drowned in a hotel pool, and they were trying to restore her heartbeat, and I became aware of her spiritual presence outside of her body, and she was, I didn't see her as much this time, but I felt her. I knew I could experience her, and she was just getting her bearings outside of her body. She was just trying to figure out this new feeling and experience for her, and then all of a sudden she was gone. And I thought, isn't that strange? Where did she go? And I looked up at the bedside monitor, and she had a heartbeat again. She wasn't gone at all. She was just back inside her body.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Wow. You know, I know that drowning victims are pretty tough to resuscitate without having, you know, major brain damage and things like that. So she'd gone back into her body. They brought her back, but I wonder if she remembered that.
Looking back, I wish I had followed up with some of these people and gone and spoke with them afterwards and asked that very question, because I almost never did that. And in fact, I never would have done that with Jeff Olson. When I sent him to the operating room that night from the trauma room, I never expected to see him again, and never would have had not that nurse drug me up to his hospital room a month later.
Well, Jeff, I think, you know, you were a doctor. You had at the time of, you know, being an ER doctor, you were a leader. You're a pillar of the community. So to come and approach somebody with something that's a little bit out of the box about a near-death experience or an out-of-body experience, you know, if I had been you, I would have thought twice about it. I think it's a hard thing to break the shell of, don't you?
I do. It always felt like I shouldn't talk about it. And part of me thought it was the experiences were too sacred to talk about. I suspect another part of me was reluctant to share because of the potential professional repercussions. But for some reason, I just didn't feel like I should talk about it. And I refused to do so for 20 plus years until I stopped seeing patients. And then I woke up one day and something just clicked, and it felt like it was okay to talk about it.
Well, I'm so glad you did. So when you decided to write your book, Not Yet, what was the catalyst for this book?
That day I just described to you, where things clicked and it felt like it was okay to talk about it. And pretty much it was that day I started to write the book, and 6 months later it was published.
So you gave yourself permission to, you know, speak your truth, I think.
Right. And Jeff Olson was writing his current book knowing at the time.
Pause. So when you were writing Not Yet, I mean, did you feel that you had a little help to nudge you in that direction?
Absolutely. There were a number of times where I felt like I had some help. In fact, when I was writing the last 2 sentences of the book, I felt this very powerful presence over my shoulder. It was so strong, it made me emotional, and I didn't recognize who it was. And I finally stopped and I said, "Who are you?" And he said, "I am your brother." And I said, "Well, what do you want me to do?" And he said, "Keep going." Initially, I thought he was talking about the book, but I was literally writing the last couple of sentences of the book when I had the experience. And a few months later, I was getting ready to go to my very first public speaking engagement near Boston. And I was in the airport with a stack of my new books in my bag and sitting in the lounge, and this young couple came and sat down next to me and started asking me the usual airport questions. Where are you going? What are you doing? And when they found out what I was going to be speaking about, this young woman's whole countenance changed, and she looked at me and said, "My grandfather just died, and he's come to me a couple of times." I initially thought, why are you telling me this? Such a profoundly intimate experience, and you're telling a total stranger. And then I realized that I was a safe place, and she knew I'd believe her.
Mm-hmm.
She took one of my books and went and got on her plane, and I got on my plane. I'd been an emergency physician for 25 years. I estimated in excess of 60,000 patients by that time. And on the plane to Boston, that voice that speaks to one's soul spoke to me and said, "You will help more people with this book than you helped as a physician in the emergency department."
Well, that's powerful.
And I came to believe, I think that's what my brother meant when he said, keep going. He wasn't talking about writing that specific book. He was talking about sharing and teaching and helping. And so I try to keep going.
Well, I believe that Not Yet is a must-read book. Where can people find your book?
It's on Amazon and Kindle throughout the world. They can also find it on my website, jeffodriscoll.com, or helpingsoulsheal.com. We'll take them to the same website.
Now,
and they can get it.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
I was just going to say, domestically, they can get my book on my website, my Not Yet, as well as my novel, as well as a series of children's books I wrote. They're all available on my website in the U.S.
Oh, I think that's wonderful. So it's Not Yet by Dr. Jeff O'Driscoll, a must read. Get it on Amazon. Is your book on Audible also?
No, a lot of people have asked me that, and I've been feeling like I needed to do it, but I haven't done it yet.
I'm an author.
But it is on Kindle.
Yeah, I've done the Kindle and the paperback, and I'm getting ready to do A Brave New World of Audible, but I've got to hire somebody because I don't think I can read all my, 3 books and do a good job. I'm not an actress. But, a nice thing that I really liked about your website is you're also an artist. Can you tell us a little bit about your art?
I started painting several years ago. I never felt like I had an artistic bone in my body. So when I started painting, I just love painting. I paint abstract. I don't like to paint realism, but and then I started to sculpt. And it's such a contrast to practicing medicine, because when I'm sculpting, if I don't like something, I just whack it off and grab a new piece of clay and redo it as many times until it's the way I like it. And you can't do that in emergency medicine. So I love to paint and sculpt.
Well, your artwork is also on your website, so people listening, go check it out and maybe buy a painting or a sculpture. Okay, now, do you label yourself? I mean, I don't like labels of medium, sensitive, but we have to kind of verbalize what your paranormal or psychic gifts are. Do you have an idea what you actually call yourself?
I usually refer to myself nowadays as an intuitive mentor. I've never been fond of the word coach, but when people talk to me about my books, when it first came out, I kind of inadvertently realized that sometimes I could discern their spiritual gifts that they weren't even aware of. When I could help them step into that and own who they were and connect to their highest self and get their own answers. And so I meet with people one-on-one and do intuitive mentoring with them.
Wonderful. That's wonderful. And it's such a positive thing. Can you do that over the phone, or do you have to be like hold a person's hand and feel their presence?
For a long time, I thought I had to be in a person's physical presence to do it, but I was kind of forced to do it over the phone a couple of times, and I was surprised with the profound experiences I had over the phone. So now, of course, with the current pandemic, most of my work is over the phone, and I enjoy doing it over the phone as well.
Well, do you think you could perhaps get an insight about myself, Laura Kethledge, and share with listeners? Or do you warm up, or I don't know the procedure, but I just thought that would be something that everybody'd like to hear about.
I have not ventured into that arena yet. When I meet with people, I usually sit down and chat with them, and over a period of time, over a period of minutes to hours, based on what they say, I usually get feelings and impressions and directions, and I kind of ease into it that way. So I haven't done any kind of cold speaking that way that you described.
Well, Jeff, that's for another show. But back to this episode. Do you have like out-of-body experiences or have lucid contact dreams? What is some of your connections really to non-physical reality?
Well, one example, I was actually in the country, in rural Utah one day, when I began to sense this experience where it was a spiritual, non-physical kind of an experience, and I was passing through this veil. And the odd thing about it was I could feel this veil kind of flowing past me as I went through it, but then I was also experiencing it as an observer from a few feet away, watching it happen to myself. And as I passed through the veil, on the other side of it, I was walking in this beautiful, verdant landscape. And the only things I had in my life were a pair of blue jeans and a white shirt and a belt that I was wearing. I was barefooted. I had nothing else in my life. And I was immediately and profoundly aware that I had nothing, that I wanted nothing, and that I missed nothing. And
so there was a contentment sweeping through you, am I correct?
Exactly. I was perfectly and totally content. And I understood that mortality is a state of discontent, always wanting something, always doing something. But the divine is a state of profound and utter contentment because you realize that you have everything you need already.
Oh, wow. That's got to be, I think there's a lot of people that want to believe that there's a continuation of existence after physical death. We all want to believe that. And, we go through to church for that, or to synagogue or whatever. But actually knowing, because you've had the perception, is must be a very grounding experience, and it must be a comfort. Am I correct?
You are very correct. And it's difficult to describe to people. I think of, I don't think of any of my experiences as being religious experiences. I think of them as being spiritual, not religious.
No.
And religion's a very prickly thing. For some people, it is very supporting and empowering, and for others, it's off-putting and contentious. So I almost never go into anything religious when I'm talking with people. I rather try and stay in the spiritual realm.
I think that's wise. I really concur with you. I think politics and religion has no place in my discussions. But I think the wonderful thing about knowing, about experiencing non-physical reality and the people there, I take great comfort. But I've always said something, and I'd like to get your opinion on this, Jeff. I think everybody has a pinch of either psychic or intuition that just comes from, quote, the other side. And I think when a lot of the messages come in sideways, or we're not able to perceive all the time, but I think there is that connection. But I don't think anybody has a full cup. I don't believe that, I can walk up to somebody in the street and say, hey, your dead Aunt Sally's talking to me, and she knows where she hid the silver before she died, and she wants you to have it. I just don't believe in that sort of thing. I think, like you're very humble. You can't conjure things up. You're very, very grounded, and that these experiences are random and just small gifts given to you. Do you agree?
I do agree. And in fact, frequently when I'm meeting with clients, they reinforce that. I've had many people come to me with a frustration that they feel they've never had a spiritual experience.
Mm-hmm.
And then as we talk, as they start to share some of their life and some of their experiences, I'm able to point their words back at them and show them that, in fact, they did have a very spiritual experience, but they minimized it or disregarded it or somehow labeled it as something different than it was. And I help them grasp a new vocabulary that enables them to own their experiences and realize what they are and what they were so that they can go forward and find them again in their future.
Oh, I think that's beautifully said. Now, as an emergency room doctor, you know, you've seen your share of tragedy. Not every patient makes it. But, you know, today with modern medicine, more people have been resuscitated than any other time in history. You doctors have saved people that would have died 100 years ago, 50 years ago, 75 years ago. You've saved so many lives. And I think that when people are coming back, they're resuscitated, they've had a near-death experience. Now with the internet, you know, there's a whole awareness movement because of it. Do you agree?
I do agree. In fact, one of my friends, Jeff Long, is a radiation oncologist, I believe, or a radiologist, I think. He has a website with over 4,500 near-death experiences on his website that people have reported to him. So yes, the awareness is growing, and in fact, some studies have suggested that as much as 5% of the general population have had some type of a near-death experience or out-of-body experience. And that number goes up to as high as 20% in people that have had severe trauma or cardiac arrest during a heart attack.
Yes, yes. It is amazing. Let me share something with you. I'd love to get your opinion. When I was 12 years old, I went horseback riding, rented a horse, ran off with me, took off, went onto the highway, and flipped up on top of me and crushed me. It was really, really a gruesome accident. But just before the horse was to crush me, Jeff, I left my body. I like zoomed out behind myself, and I saw myself sitting on the horse as it was just about to fall. And it was so crystal clear that I could see the dried out pine needles on the nearby trees. And this was like a, you know, 96-degree weather in the middle of August in 1972. So I left my body. I was just a little kid, but I can still remember the tank top I was wearing, and then all of a sudden the rush right back into my physical body like a slingshot, and then of course I got clobbered by the horse. So have you had any patients, what I'm asking, that have recounted in the ER, oh my gosh, you know, I just before the car hit me or the bike hit me or I fell, that I saw the accident happen? Has anybody recounted any similar stories like kids like that I went through?
I have had friends that have had near-death experiences that have told me the same similar things to what you just said. Oddly enough, I have very few experiences with my emergency department patients because it's usually not the appropriate time in the ER to ask somebody about that kind of an experience. They either don't wake up fully from it immediately, or if they do wake up, it doesn't seem to be the right conversation because you're immersed in their medical care. So personally, I spoke to very, very few of my patients about near-death experiences while I was practicing medicine. Most of my experience with people talking about their near-death experience has been since I left the practice of medicine.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. That's a good point. Do you believe, now this is my hypothesis, Jeff. This is really my hypothesis. This is Laura Kethledge's thoughts. I think that after you've had a near-death experience or an out-of-body experience before, like a catastrophic accident, I think it opens up a window or a door, and you're able to perceive more more afterwards, that you're able to perceive souls and you have more, quote, paranormal type encounters. Do you agree? Is that a good description of it?
I think that is a good description of it. Many people after a near-death experience recognize spiritual gifts or capacities that they did not appreciate before their experience. It's as though a door is open during the experience and it never fully closes.
I never felt like I even fully returned after my NDE in 1979. But me, having kind of being a very vocal, outspoken person in general, I told my emergency room doctor in Fairfax Hospital in April 1979 what had happened. And you know what he said to me? What drugs have you taken? And that shamed me so deeply that I didn't talk about it for a long time. And then I reached out to yet another doctor to kind of recount what had happened because I was struggling with it. And it was the second time I was shamed. Do you think the medical community is more accepting or less abusive to patients who try to recount a near-death experience today?
It's very unfortunate that so many patients have encountered negative reactions from their physician when they tried to share these things. In general, I think physicians are not aware of the prevalence of near-death experiences and how common they truly are. They have a scientific bent that they would explain them due to anoxic brain injury or temporal lobe seizures or dumping of neurotransmitters. There's a host, and drugs, of course. There's a host of explanations, but they've all been looked at very carefully, and none of them really explains the near-death experience well. Several of my friends are physicians who have had near-death experiences, like Mary Neal and Eben Alexander, and they don't subscribe to those explanations either. They've studied them themselves, having been experiencers. Rather, what we should say as physicians when somebody describes such an experience, we should say something along the lines of, that's not uncommon, and we can talk about that more, or I can have somebody that's experienced in that field come and talk with you about it. I'm not asking physicians to accept it or to change their philosophical belief system or anything like that. Just acknowledge that it's real for the person that experienced it and connect them with somebody who can validate their experience.
Oh, I think that's really well said. Have you talked to doctors, physician groups? Have you thought about doing that to educate them?
I would love to do that. There's not very many venues that are open to doing that, however. They're reluctant to acknowledge it. There's a few people in the field. A friend of mine, Bruce Grayson, is coming out with a book near the end of this year, I believe. He's a psychiatrist who started the Division of Perceptual Studies at University of Virginia. He studied it for 40 years. In fact, he was the attending physician when Raymond Moody went to med school at UVA and coined the term near-death experience.
Oh, that's very fascinating. I really took a lot of comfort reading Life After Life, and Dr. Moody was Raymond Moody is a true pioneer in the near-death studies, and such a gracious, humble man to be so generous to do so many shows and really help folks. I mean, I'm doing this show because I struggled so hard after my near-death experience or expanded awareness. I wasn't really cut out for this sort of thing. I guess nobody is. But I was least likely, to be pulled into, seeing a spirit or having afterlife communication with somebody. I've gotten good messages, and, when I want it to happen, it doesn't. And when it does, it's random, uncontrolled, and the message always comes in sideways, as I say. So I have a little, lighthearted humor with it. But I think a lot of people struggle with it because we think in such black and white terms of physical reality and good common sense. And when you're an American and you're very grounded into society, it's hard to, accept that could be realities outside of the physical realm. And the cool thing is, I had a naysayer say to me one time when I was doing a show, "Oh, how do you know you don't make all this stuff up?" And I said, well, my imagination's not that creative. I'm a creative writer, but I'm not that smart. And in 100 years, we'll both be dead and we'll know for sure. So I think we've got to take a little grain of salt with this and not be so serious. Do you agree with me?
I do agree. I think we are frequently reluctant messengers, wishing we hadn't received the message, let alone feeling like we need to share it. In fact, Raymond Moody told me that for 40 years as a researcher, he remained an objective, generally skeptic researcher, and did not believe in life after death, even though he was doing all this research and writing these books. He told me that when he read my book and when he heard about my experience with Jeff Olson and his wife Tamara, that was the tipping point for him, and he gave up his doubts and concluded that there was indeed life after death after reading my book.
Well, I think, the sincerity of yourself and Jeff Olson is very profound, and people pick up on that. And you're not snake oil salesmen. You were both established in careers, very conventional people, leaders in your community. You didn't come out of nowhere and try to sell something for a buck. You wrote books and you spoke out of the heart in order to help other people. I mean, we're all going through, you don't get through life without tragedy. If you live long enough, there's bound to be tragedy. You lose a spouse or a child or go through an illness or a bankruptcy. I mean, nobody skates through life unscathed. But I think your book is really important in books like this because your message is one of being positive, and it is one of knowing that there is this profound love that exists in the non-physical. And when we graduate out of this physical life, I guess that's the way to say it, instead of death, we go towards something. I think your book can give a lot of comfort to people, especially people that have gone through crisis and maybe towards the end of their life. Don't you agree?
I do. And as a matter of fact, in my personal experiences and in those of my friends that I've spoken with, when they've had these near-death or shared death experiences, they feel closer to that genuine, authentic life that is theirs, to that eternal or spiritual nature that is theirs. They feel more alive in those experiences when they're clinically dead than at any other time, which is why the subtitle of my book, Not Yet, the subtitle is Near Life Experiences and Lessons Learned. Because I think we're nearer to our life, our eternal life, when that veil's thin or drawn back altogether.
Yes, you said it much better than I could ever say it. Okay, my question is, because you've had this wonderful ability, Jeff, you have this great communication with the recently dead or the dying, the shared near-death experience. Do you believe that changed your core values or improved your core values as a human being?
I'd like to think that it makes me less judgmental. I'd like to think that it makes me more inclined to experience and share unconditional love. Almost universally, the people that I know that have had near-death experiences or these other spiritually transformative experiences have come to this realization that what matters most is that thing we have such a hard time describing, which is profound, infinite, unconditional love. And that's what I hope my experiences have made me more attuned to, and that's one of the reasons I share, is to try and convey that message to others. I was going to be speaking to a large group a while back, and I was trying to center and get a message and find out, what am I supposed to say? And it came to me very clearly, very unmistakably, a three-part message. Tell them they're enough. Tell them they're divine. Tell them they're loved. And frequently that's the message I try to share.
Well, that's a very powerful message that you're sharing. It's a very comforting message, but also in times like this, we kind of need leaders like you. I mean, it is taken the isolation out of the person that lives in Iowa, out in the country, that has a near-death experience. They don't feel so alone because they hear someone like you. They read your books, or and the isolation, is evaporating after people have near-death experiences. But they have to actually open their eyes and do the research. You just can't go home and not talk about it. But it's a wonderful message. Can you tell me 3 points of special interest in your book, Not Yet?
3 points of special interest. Wow.
Take your time.
I can tell you, let me tell you 1 point of special interest, and then if you want two more, we'll talk about it.
Okay.
I walked into a patient care room one evening, and the patient on the gurney was a gentleman. I estimated he was in his mid to late 50s. He was homeless. He had long hair and an unkempt beard and tattered clothing. He struggled with addiction issues. He was the antithesis of everything society defines as success. Mm-hmm. And I looked down at his feet, and he had holes in his shoes and holes in his socks, and there was snow on the ground. His feet were not in good shape, and I knew what needed to be done. He did as well, and we were the only two people in the room. I don't think we even hardly said anything to each other. I filled a wash basin with warm water and put some soap in it, and I sat down at the foot of the gurney. I took off his shoes and the last threads of his socks, and I lowered his feet into that water, and I proceeded to wash his feet. And when I looked up, something miraculous happened. This veil that obscures our vision was drawn back, and I saw his soul. I saw who he was. I saw in him the divine.
Oh my
and
God.
the soul of every man who suffers, every woman who struggles. And I knew who he was. And when I went into the room, I thought I was going to be serving him. And when I left, I realized that he was there to minister to me.
Oh my God.
And he was teaching me who every soul in the world is. And it changed the way I viewed every patient afterwards.
Oh my gosh. And he was a throwaway person, in society's eyes.
I think he was there to teach me that the person you're sitting next to is divine, whether you're sitting in church or in the gutter. And you have to remember that every day.
Yeah. I think that is very, very beautiful. Did you ever, as your second point of interest, did you ever find anything, let's say, lighthearted or humorous in your experience?
Yes, I think that the Creator has a sense of humor. I remember when I was 19 years old, I started using a notebook in my daily meditations or prayers, and I would jot down notes to myself, jot down messages or feelings I'd receive, and it became a very powerful form of communication, which I'd used for decades. And then one day I learned about these things in early American history called prayer rods and folk magic. People would have this rod, this stick or something. They'd hold it in their hand, and they'd ask a question, and they'd let go of the stick. And if it fell one way, the answer was yes. And if it fell the other, the answer was no. And I remember thinking, that'd be really cool. I want a prayer rod. And I was actually praying about a prayer rod. And I was kneeling in prayer, and a voice spoke to me and said, get up and write. And so I got up off my knees. I pulled out my notebook and the pen I'd been using for years to write these communications, and I started to write. And the voice said to me, "You have a rod in your hand by which you receive answers. Neglect not your gift." And I looked at the pen and I started to laugh, and I thought, oh man, God does have a sense of humor. I'm asking for a prayer rod. He's been speaking to me in sentences for decades. We're so naive sometimes.
Yeah, it's nice to have something more lighthearted. Do you believe that perhaps your higher self, another aspect of you, is kind of steering the boat?
Oh, absolutely. Whether you say God or creator or source, and I use all of those, I think they all are steering us toward our higher self. I tell people when I mentor with them, because a lot of them struggle to try and decide, is this the divine speaking to me, or is it my own voice? And I help them understand, listen, if you think and you ponder and meditate and you conclude that the voice you're hearing is your own, it's still divine, because you're divine.
Yes. Yeah, that we are part of a whole. You know, let me get back to your brother. I don't mean to touch on a painful subject. You know, you lost him when you were young. You had contact with him. Did you share that with your parents while they were alive?
My parents are still alive.
Oh, I didn't know that.
After after they read my book, they said, "How come we didn't know these things?"
So you didn't talk to them about contact with your brother till later, till you were an adult?
Right. 20 years after my brother died, I thought that I'd gotten through this without any major impact on my life, my brother's death. And 20 years after he died, he came to me and he said, "You need to go talk with their mother because there's things she's never told you about my death." And that kind of got my attention. So I went and visited with my mother. And my mother told me that day, for the first time, she said, "I always knew where you were in the house before Stan died because I could hear you singing. After your brother died, you stopped singing." And that was something that helped me realize that, you know, his death had a major impact on me, that it affected me dramatically. And that was one of the things that started me along the path of kind of decoding a lot of my experiences and my feelings about death and dying and such. So just about a year ago, my brother came to me again, and he took me by the hand, and everything earthly faded away, and he guided me through this profoundly spiritual place that I think most people would call heaven. And he showed me my life in review. He showed me the days where my life changed course dramatically, and he showed me that it was him that had intervened on my behalf on those days.
Oh my.
And he showed me the day he died from my parents' perspective instead of my own. And I'd always thought that my deepest wound was the death of my brother, but when I saw my parents and I saw it from their perspective, I realized the deeper wound was seeing the pain of my parents and not being able to help them. And then he said to me, "Go tell our parents not to be sad anymore. Tell them I'm okay and that I want them to smile when they talk about me."
The death of a sibling, it's the most traumatic thing I think you can go through, because from the cradle to the grave, you know, there are historians and meant to go to old age with us and never die, to die young. It's a terrible thing. And then there's no greater responsibility than being the sibling and having to look out for your grieving parents. So your parents did take comfort in that you've had contact with your brother and these other wonderful, miraculous events.
Yes, they were very warm to it. They were accepting and supportive, and so I was glad that I chose to share with them, and that it brought them some comfort.
Well, I think that the listeners need to get out and get your book immediately. Not yet. It's right on Amazon, and you can go to Jeff O'Driscoll. Oh, I can never say your last name. O'Driscoll.com, and be connected with the art, your blog, you know, what you're doing. Do you have any appearances scheduled after the pandemic?
Well, last month I was supposed to be speaking in London and then in Ireland, and we had to cancel those, of course. There was a group of 600 people in South Carolina I was going to be speaking to last week. We had to cancel that. So I think everything's canceled right through the end of the year. So I've been doing a fair number of blogs and Zoom virtual meetings. So we've had a number of those, but I don't think I'm scheduled to speak any place live until this virus calms down.
Yeah, it's slowed the whole world down, but pardon me. So do you have a special message you want to share with our potential reader of Not Yet?
A messenger came to me a while back and said, every experience is to enable you to help someone else. And I said, wait a minute, because sometimes I argue with my voices. I said, wait a minute, I thought experiences were for personal growth, and then I could go help people if I wanted to. And the messenger said, the primary purpose of every experience is to enable you to help someone else. You get the secondary benefit of personal growth. Changed my whole perspective about why we go through challenges and hardships and difficult things. Mm-hmm. I don't know that if it applies to anybody else. I just know that's what was said to me that day. And so when I'm going through something hard, I try to ask two questions. What am I supposed to learn from this? And how can I use it to help someone else? And that turns my most challenging experiences into opportunities for growth and for service. And I try and share that with people.
Well, Jeff, this has just been a wonderful interview. I thank you for coming on Near-DeathTV. I hope that everybody runs out and buys Not Yet. And I really want to part you with some words of wisdom. Can you give us some words of wisdom before we close out the show?
Yes, one little thing for people. A lot of people tell me they've never had a spiritual experience, and they ask me, how can I have a spiritual experience? And I tell them, do this one small, simple thing, and you'll have a spiritual experience. When you meditate or pray or exercise or whatever you do to get centered in the morning, ask this one question. What can I do to serve someone else today? And I promise you, you will have a name or a face flash through your mind or an inclination to do something for somebody else. And if you accept it and honor it and act on it, you will come to realize that is a spiritual experience. And as you practice it, you will get better at it.
Well, that's a wonderful way to close this show. And I look forward to having you on again. Well, that's all for today, folks. And thank you again, Dr. O'Driscoll. Good day.
Oh, thank you very much.